Hello and welcome to episode 96 of Can We Still Be Friends, a podcast that tests the limits of the friendship between two people who mistake movie taste for personal morality. I'm Nate Goss, here with Ryan Ebling. Today we are excited to welcome a very special guest, Pastor Watson Jones, professor and senior pastor at Compassion Baptist Church on Chicago's South Side and a former classmate of ours from college. Watson wanted to discuss The King's Speech, directed by Tom Hooper and starring Colin Firth, Geoffrey Rush, and Helena Bonham Carter. Though it's been some time since Ryan and I have seen The King's Speech, we're looking forward to hearing what the movie means to Watson and how the intimate story of a very public figure's private struggles can speak to us commoners.
The King's Speech was pretty roundly praised by critics and audiences alike. With a worldwide gross of nearly $430 million, it entered awards season as an unlikely frontrunner in an unusually strong year for movies with 12 nominations. It ended up winning not only Best Picture, but Best Actor for Colin Firth, Best Director for Tom Hooper, and Best Original Screenplay. As far as Best Picture winners go, it hasn't necessarily stayed in the public consciousness, but is very much a predecessor to shows like The Crown and the upcoming movie Spencer about Princess Diana, demonstrating that there is a deep well of interest for the behind-closed-doors lives of England's royal family.
But does The King's Speech go further than airing the unknown dirty laundry of our betters?
Yeah, what do we have to learn from the struggles of elites? Keep listening.
Hopeless. Hopeless! You were sublime. Would I lie to a prince of the realm to win 12 pennies?
I've no idea what an Australian might do for that sort of money.
Let me play it back to you.
No.
All right, then. I get to ask you the questions.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't feel this is for me. Thank you for your time. Bye.
All right, so that's Academy Award winner Colin Firth giving his Academy Award-winning performance as King George VI there in that clip, and that in that section he's a bit frustrated.
A low point for him, yeah.
Yeah, and that's his performance in the movie we are discussing in today's episode, The King's Speech, a movie that was suggested we discuss with our guest, Watson Jones, who is here. Welcome, Watson.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, we're excited to have you. We had no idea what you would pick, and The King's Speech kind of surprised me, but then I was like, oh, I can actually see how this might be something that, like, a pastor and that you specifically would be interested in talking about, but I'm really excited to hear what you have to say about it.
And before we dive right into it, let's just back up a little bit and maybe just talk about, what you do, who you are. Now, we went to college with you at
That's
Trinity.
Right. That's right. And you guys look the same.
You do too.
You do too, actually. Not much changes over what we were talking about. Close to 15 years or so?
Yes, 15 years, my lord.
I feel like I've got a lot more forehead than I did back then.
I have way more forehead.
The thing is, so we met in college, but
That's
we
right.
actually haven't really seen each other since college.
That's right.
Although I feel like for me, what's been really great is kind of following you on Facebook, on Instagram, and just I love following you on social media. I think you always have such wise words to say about what we're going through, or I just enjoy reading what you read. And then on Instagram, I felt like me and you kind of had this connection over things like Fleetwood Mac and Genesis. I would put those records up, and I'd be like, yeah, I know if I put this up, Watson's going to get it.
That's right. I'm going to be the first one to like it.
You're going to be the first one to like.
And my daughter will too. She
jacket required.
She loves it. That's right.
That's awesome.
Now, what does she? She loves the Phil Collins, the Genesis, the Fleetwood Mac, all of it.
She plays every day. I want to say during the pandemic, she played 2 albums, like records, on my record player. She played No Jackets Required to the point where certain songs skip, like Susu Studio skips now.
You got to get a new copy.
I got to get a new copy, but they're like a lot of money. Yeah. And then she to this day plays not Fleetwood Mac, Chicago, one of Chicago's albums.
Oh, okay.
And she's figured out the little speed button. And so she likes to speed it up and listen to the Chipmunks sing it. And then I come and turn it down. And then she speeds it back up. But that's like her thing.
That's
awesome.
great. for whatever reason, my kids, my boys, they don't even think to touch the records. It's almost like it's an unspoken sacred thing. Like, you don't touch dad's records. I've tried to even get them into it, but I feel like it must be the way I handle them, where I brush them and, I kind of easily take them out. And I think they see that and they're kind of like, I'm not touching that stuff.
I know. It started with her, well, my daughter's autistic, so repetition for her is big. But for her, it started when she was a baby. I used to play like the Beatles, and I would have her in my arms and I would dance around the room singing these songs. And I've maintained a record player at least her whole life. And I would, throughout periods of my life, just play different records. And for whatever reason, she fell in love with that No Jackets Required. And then that Chicago, I don't even remember which Chicago album it is because they got like 900, but she fell in love with those and she plays them every day.
Wow.
That's great.
It's good that it's stuff that you like.
Oh, yeah.
That's true.
That's my baby girl. She loves my music. Her mama music, she don't care nothing about her mama's music, but she loves my music.
It's Phil Collins. What's not to like,
Amen.
Well, okay, so King's Speech.
Yeah, what we tend to do is we talk about like first viewings, like what do you remember about the first time you watched it? So when did you first watch this movie?
I went to the movies to see it when it first came out. I think it came out in like 2010, 2011, maybe even before then.
No, 2010,
2010. I think I was still in seminary, actually. In fact, I was. And, I go to the movies a lot by myself, pre-pandemic at least. And I went to go see it because I like Colin Firth, number one. Number two, I'm a real big fan of British cinema, British TV. And so I went to go see it. And I just remember, and I'm not the most emotional guy, but I remember watching that movie and several times, like feeling like I was going to break out in tears. And then at the end of it, like just feeling like I was going to cry. And I was like, what is this? And so it was the very first time I saw it in the theater. I fell in love with that movie. And I have a slew of favorites, and I'm not a slew, but at least a handful. But I mean, consistently, man, that's 11 years later. And it's a movie that I still can go to and just like be amazed by new things I didn't notice before. And even deeper developments of thought, like as an adult who's 37 now and thinking about life. And like I'm able to watch that movie and certain things make a little more sense to me. And so ever since then, and I bought it back when DVDs were for sale. And my wife can tell you, man, there was a period where I watched that movie at least twice a week.
Really?
Yes. And then because I knew it so well, it would play almost in the background while I was sitting at the table doing work. And it was just an enjoy. I mean, I own the soundtrack and everything. It was just a moving film, and it just touched me deeply.
So it's been a part of your life ever since then.
It has.
And if it's something that, I can imagine if it's something that like I'm sure the things you were working on, your studies, those sorts of things are part of who have formed you. Yes. That movie was part of that whole process too.
Yes.
That's really fascinating.
My wife thinks it's so strange that I watched it because I tease her she watches The Office a lot or like Parks and Recs, and she knows these episodes by heart. She'll watch some of them. Yeah. And I was like, why are you doing this? She says, we're not going to start on your King of Speech kick.
She's always got that in her back pocket.
Always in her back pocket. I'm like, man, that was a great film. It was a great film.
Yeah. I feel like we all kind of have those. I mean, it's like comfort food, but it's like the comfort movies, the ones that you probably couldn't even give us a number of how many times you've seen it. And even if you could, sometimes maybe you're just having it on the background, like you said, like it's just sort of, it becomes sort of part of who you are, Yeah. I am curious, I know you said that you're a fan of Colin Firth and of, British, television movies, but was it just one that you were always going to see in the theater, or was there something about it that you were like, I think this one's going to be great, because I think for me, and me and Ryan should probably get into our first viewings as well. But my first viewing isn't all that memorable because for me, it was really just about catching up for the Oscars.
Right.
Ryan, we were just talking about the other movies that came out that year. It was like Social Network,
Black Swan, Toy Story 3.
Yeah, it was. There was so many good movies that came out.
That's right.
That year. And there were so many good movies that were kind of more probably targeted towards my tastes, I guess. It's a Darren Aronofsky film, a David Fincher film. I'm going to go see those. And Tom Hooper, I didn't have any familiarity really with Tom Hooper.
No.
I knew who Colin Firth was, but
Right.
I only knew him as, Mr. Darcy.
That's the only way I knew him too, Mr. Darcy, because my wife made me watch that
with the Pride and Prejudice series.
That's right.
And so for me, it was kind of like, okay, this is getting a lot of big buzz. It's going to be an Oscar contender. And then it was nominated for Best Picture. And I was like, for me, it was kind of like, I guess I have to see this. And I did like it. But Ryan, was it kind of similar for you? Was that kind of your story as well?
Yeah, it's tough when it's that like end of the year and I'm just watching a ton of stuff and it can get lost kind of in that shuffle. And so honestly, it's not one that I've seen again since, I don't think. Until we rewatched it here, which was part of why I was so interested that you picked it. I was like, because for me, it's not one that has certainly not to the extent that it has been for you, but it hasn't been one that I've revisited. And so I remember liking it, and I remember understanding why everybody was buzzing about it. But it didn't. Yeah, I guess it didn't stand out to me so much.
Yeah.
Well, and to be honest, Watson, I think and especially at that time, I was probably at my film snobbiest ever.
So if anything was too popular, it was going to be.
It was like, forget this. Turn this off.
And I followed the Oscar races and all that stuff, and then I watched it, and then like I said, all these other movies came out that I really loved, and then I have to be honest, I think there was just a bit of backlash for me because it was all about the comparison. I was not able to really take it on its own merits because I could only see it as a comparison to these other movies, and then when it won. Then that became its reputation to me.
And there's almost always backlash against the Best Picture winner.
Yeah, that's true. Any movie that wins Best Picture, it's almost like you should be required to revisit it like 10 years later.
Yeah, absolutely.
To actually look at it for what it is.
Absolutely.
But I guess going back to my original question is, I guess I'm just wondering, like, was there something specifically about this story or the movie itself or just the buzz around it that you were like, yes, I'm going to go to the theater by myself to go watch this movie.
Yeah, did you see yourself connecting with it, or did it surprise you too? Like your reaction?
You know what it was, but bizarrely enough, this is just so weird. So because I had to think about that, like what made me so interested in this movie? The year prior, I had gone to England. In 2009, I led the gospel choir there. And so the Trinity Gospel Choir. So we were in England. And of course, I saw like Buckingham Palace, I saw Windsor, and, I had to read a book called Know Your English for a whole different anthropology course I took. But reading that book, Know Your English, and going to England kind of got me interested in the nuances of English culture. Sort of like, in terms of how they view the weather and how weather, it paints their reality almost, their hello is they just start talking about the weather, and how in talking about the weather, you can understand how someone feels or even the distance that, and Americans have an element of this too, but the distance that people would have with one another in terms of spatial, like, or privacy, the notion of this is my castle. There's a part where he says this, my castle, my rules, right. This notion of my own private castle, and you don't ask me my name, so the personal nature that these two characters had, people in England are friends, of course, but there is a sense where, people are a little slower to become personable and friends with someone in English culture. Now, again, this is generally speaking, I'm not a cultural anthropologist. So with all of that in my mind, and then I saw sites, I went to St. George's Cathedral, where I believe George VI is buried, so there was always a sort of interest in my head. Now, I don't know all those kings and queens, but there was an interest. So when I see this advertisement for the King of England, the King's Speech, and there's some kind of way in the trailer letting me know this is about King Henry VI. Oh, wow, that's Elizabeth's father. I don't know much about him other than I saw where he was buried. And so it was like, I want to see what this is. And I am someone who's deeply interested in history. Like, I'll mention some of that later on, but in terms of like the role that he played in the time period that he was playing. And then I get there and I'm taken aback by the story. because I didn't think that's what the story was about. And I remember thinking like the King's Speech. So, okay, well, maybe this is like, I Have a Dream, Dr. King, it's like him building up to how he wrote that speech or something. Yeah. I had no idea that it would take the story it took.
So you didn't even know it was about like overcoming a stuttering problem or, or even like what Jeffrey Rush's character was or anything like that, which was how, I didn't know anything about it either, really.
I didn't.
Nobody really did.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I feel like I had heard that he might have been referred to as King George the Stammerer. I think I'd heard that before. And there might have been even someone even further back in history that also may have had a stammer. But, people stutter. People stutter. There are people who stutter worse than others. But, I never thought that it was like something that almost handicapped him.
Right. Our current president has
precisely
stuttering.
Oh man, he stutters all the time.
Right.
he missays. I mean, he misfires on words. He'll say something. Oh wait. I don't mean that. It's like a brain freeze.
Mm-hmm.
But I think too, they, it to me, and I think I saw all of those movies. By the way, some of the ones that were major ones in 2010.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm also one who really likes. I mean, all those movies have stories and storylines, and because it's not a movie without it. But I really like drama like that, that kind of takes you personal,
kind of like character-driven
kind of stuff. Yeah. I'm really into that kind of stuff. But I watch anything, but nuanced people, like people who you might see a picture of, because clearly there are coins with his face on it. I mean, they're not in circulation anymore, but you've seen them if you look in the book. But to see they were also nuanced in some way. That's kind of interesting to me.
Well, then maybe we should, dig in a little bit deeper and start getting into our rewatch a little bit and actually start looking at some pieces of this movie. Can I ask you though, so you rewatched this for the podcast.
Yes.
How long had it been before that since you had seen it? Are we talking like a couple days? like a year or so, or
I think it might have been about 4 years.
So you were still, there was a little bit of a gap there. Like, did it, I guess, what did it feel like this time around, returning to it after that little bit of space? Was it kind of like going back to something like a cozy blanket, or was it, a little different, or?
No, it was like going back to a cozy blanket. Interestingly enough, I felt the same emotions that I felt the first time I saw it. The same. Like I was sitting there and like I could feel tears welling up in my eyes almost. And so I felt those same emotions. Even when I listened to the soundtrack, I can feel those same emotions. I think the good thing about it, with there being a gap, I think that because it wasn't so fresh, it felt like I was watching it over again. Even though I knew, oh yeah, this next scene, he's about to talk to his brother who's going to run up the stairs, because he's crying about the fact he's about to be king. Like I knew it, but it still was like, oh yeah, that's interesting. I never paid attention to that.
So you were seeing new things.
Oh
even this
tons
time.
of new things. Oh yeah, it's almost like, so like in my field of study for my school, I promise I won't go nerd on this. It is
go nerd, do it. Yeah,
as a person who studies homiletics and a little bit of rhetoric, we look at texts. So in my case, sermon texts, but I've also read texts of speeches from like, Abraham Lincoln and things like that. But you look at texts and you see what those texts meant then, but then you come back to them and you read them years later. And, you as the reader, the critic, you have different life experiences. You think differently about different things. You've read different books. You've been exposed to newer fields of knowledge. And so now when you come to another film, the story doesn't change, but it's almost as if its meaning takes a different form because life, you're now interpreting it through a different lens.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And if I can talk about my rewatch a little bit, I had forgotten how big a role the leadership during wartime was taking for him. Like how it wasn't just that first speech where it was a ceremonial speech that he was nervous about giving. It was like, no, this one needs to put the nation at ease. Like this needs to prepare the country for another war that they are still healing from.
That's right.
And how big a job that was for him.
Right.
And he had seen his brother, who was prepped that whole time, not be able to live up to it. And he himself was feeling like basically like dodging a bullet,
Mhm.
having been the second born son, that he would not have to do that. And now he does have to. And sort of like, what does it mean for a leader to lead in a crisis? Obviously is something we've been thinking about the last
Yes.
couple of years.
Yes.
And as the crises compound,
Yeah, no kidding.
like as COVID
Yeah.
gets worse, as Afghanistan gets worse, as like things are happening, it was like you're absolutely like you're saying, the context and the response is different from 2010 when
Yes.
I think we all felt pretty secure,
Kind of,
just
yeah.
generally speaking.
It was almost like you'd watch it as like, wow, what that would have been hard to live at that time, and
Yeah.
and now we are, we
Yeah.
are kind of living in a time that I think we're going to look back at and be like, man, that was a hard time to live through.
Oh yeah.
A movie that was a window is now a mirror.
Yeah,
I had-
exactly.
I had the very same thought. There was a scene in the movie where he's riding to Buckingham Palace and he's in the car, and this is right before the speech. And, and you can kind of see the camera, panning along, and you can see how, the entryways to the underground were padded with sandbags and people were running there as the siren was going off. And then he looks up when he gets out the car. He says, "Oh, the balloons are up. They got those up fast." When the first time I saw that, didn't know what those balloons were about until I read The Splendid and the Vile. Didn't finish it yet, but I started it last summer and then started class again, but which was about Churchill. And they talked about how they raised these balloons all over populated areas as a way to really try to bring, because the planes had to fly low enough to see who they were going to bomb. They had these balloons that were raised almost to act as a dragnet, so to speak, to the planes, that the planes would run into them and bring them down. And I'm like, oh, wow. And it's only when you kind of consider the history of the period and you realize, oh, man, they didn't know this yet, but they were about to get really bombed, and the threat of a despot, who had taken over all of Western Europe and was on his way to England. And then you also consider, like, all of this is in my mind, knowing that in a few years, there's Churchill who would be literally begging Roosevelt to send money, to send ships because their navy wasn't strong enough to fight Hitler, like knowing just how they were literally standing at the brink of an existential threat. And then I look at now, through all that we've seen from January 6th to the pandemic, to the 6,000 waves of the pandemic and the hundreds of thousands of deaths. No one could have imagined at the beginning of February 2020, when coronavirus was kind of just being uttered about in the news, and, just how the world changes. And, we all were on lockdown. Grocery stores were almost empty. That felt apocalyptic to them, but it also felt apocalyptic to us.
Yeah. And I actually think that's something that the movie does really well without hammering it. You very much feel the dread in the movie,
Yes.
I think. And I also think it puts you in this place of, oh, that would be hard to come out of the Great War and come out of that thinking, boy, that was terrible. We're never doing that again. And then to see this and be like, what is going on? We're honestly going to do this. We're going to go through this all over again. Are you kidding me? And then to have to be a leader during that.
Yes.
And then to have this personal issue of like, obviously there's the speech impediment, but there's also just the self-confidence that comes with that and feeling like you're not worthy. Yeah, I do feel like this was, for me on the rewatch, a very fresh experience. I watched it totally anew and had a very new appreciation for it. And even in the filmmaking, because one thing I really noticed about it's a dark movie visually.
It is.
Yeah.
It never really brightens up. And I think that goes back to what you were saying about the weather. It's British in that way, even in moments that...
Even in the interiors, yeah.
Yeah, in the interiors, and even in these sort of like optimistic moments, it never really gets bright, ever.
Yeah, I don't remember a sunny day in the movie.
No,
really,
it wasn't. If you think about it, like there's a scene where Logue and Bertie are walking down through this parkway, and it's foggy as all get out. Now, I've been to England. I was only there for 2 weeks. I don't remember it ever looking like that. But, we know London fog, that's a thing. But it's foggy, it's gloomy. And Bertie is sort of symbolically walking off into this fog. But his life is that. His life is that fog. It's that dark, scary place where you cannot see the surroundings at all. Like if you watch the film and you're aware of places, you don't know where that is.
Right. It's not one of those like, oh, there's that building. And oh, there's very little to orient you through those sorts of landmarks. And I also noticed how the interiors are so empty. Even when it's a room of crowded people, it's a huge room. Like when he walks into the room to sort of become king.
Yes.
There are a lot of people there, but it is a empty room, of just cavernous sort of empty room. That theme of being on display and feeling so isolated is visually represented all over the movie. And then it's also repeated in his life story, talking about how he grew up with several brothers and sisters and family and people all around, but it's very clear he felt alone that whole time.
Utterly alone.
And the way people related to him was cruel, right? Like his father tried to make him afraid of him, like a stated goal. And I think it can be a hard thing to drum up sympathy for royalty,
Yeah.
But I think that was another thing that struck me this time, is that they do it in a really natural way, in a really organic way, in a way that, I don't know. And I think part of it is Colin Firth's attempts at acting like he's above that pain. Like, well, yes, of course they talked to me that way. Of course they made fun of me. Like, yeah, people did that to me. And then that is where Jeffrey Rush, I think, was so vital to this movie, because his performance is just very understated, but the way he, reacts to that, it's just like, that was wrong.
Yeah, there's a tenderness there that's very touching, I think. When it comes to these pieces, you never know exactly how much is, true, how much is dramatized. And you look and you read it and you're like, it wasn't that far off. Lionel Logue was someone who, he went to for an hour each day for weeks and weeks before this. And Lionel Logue did stay in his life throughout, the rest of his life. We don't really know what happened in those speech therapy sessions because he didn't keep a journal or a log of it. He did. And I thought I read he didn't.
I watched one of the special features.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you've watched those, Watson. But
years ago,
they said that just a few weeks before they started filming, Lionel Logue's grandson found his diary in the attic.
Okay.
And it was the only record anywhere. Like, there aren't pictures of Lionel Logue, really. He was a really, like, kind of hidden, forgotten figure in the story of George VI. But they actually ended up adding lines of dialogue that came from his diary. And, like, right after he finished his speech, and he said, you still stuttered on the W or something. And George said, well, I had to throw some in there so they'd know it was me.
Yeah.
That was taken from his diary. Like, that was something they actually said to each other.
Wow. That's interesting, because that to me felt like a screenplay.
Yeah.
that didn't feel real. But yeah, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. So I don't know if you've ever actually listened to the real King's speech that's recorded.
I feel like I heard snippets of it before.
I listened to it right before we started recording, and I was like, man, he nailed it.
Spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you, as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you.
And speak to you.
Myself. For the second time in the lives of most
For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war.
He does kind of nail exactly the delivery of how, the how much pause there was. After you watch this movie and you listen to that speech, it's just like, oh wow, that's a real person.
That's
who
right.
had this real issue, issue that he was overcoming. And how many people listening to it, if you're just a person in England at the time listening to it, just have no idea. And it's just sort of a reminder of, like, what about speeches I've listened to? And you just got no idea what's going on behind the scenes, and no idea what's going on with that person that's causing them to do, to act a certain way. And it's interesting because I think if you listen to the speech, I think it's totally true what Lionel says in the movie, where he basically says, silence adds solemnity. If you listen to that speech and you don't know the reason for a lot of those pauses, it has that effect. It does add this weight to what he's saying, to just pause and to just leave these silences in there. It made
But
me think even now, because I think our contemporary politicians' speeches, people who give sort of public addresses, it would be so foreign now for us to hear someone with that much pause.
That many pauses,
everything.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, we don't know how to, in public speaking now, no one knows how to do those kind of pauses until you speak to someone who, no one is necessarily like up and thriving from that generation. That's an adult. Yeah. That was an adult then, but you speak to someone, maybe the generation under, who was a public speaker, meaning that they're in their 80s now. And when they speak in these metered tones and they'll pause a lot, and you'll think they're done and they're not. And they're just, kind of pausing to catch their breath, their thoughts. It's real deliberate. But even if you think about silence, I remember thinking about this, especially as I noticed this time, there's a lot of silence in the movie, especially in the earlier parts. For example, the very first meeting, there is nothing. You don't hear anything. You barely hear a creak on the floor. There's pauses as he's clearly trying to get his words out of his mouth. There's silence in the room and silence, as he's trying to catch his voice throughout the whole show, throughout the whole movie, really. The music doesn't even pick up until he starts to sort of develop his voice.
Yeah.
That's
a
really
really interesting.
Or locate his voice, rather.
Right, right. And the way that silence transforms throughout the movie, too.
Yes.
Where at the beginning, that first speech, that's a really jarring opening, actually.
Oh, and the way the stammering just reverberates through everything.
Yes.
It hits you hard. Yeah.
I have received from His Majesty the King.
And I think a lot of that is the director, Tom Hooper, told, because Colin Firth was sort of like, as he was preparing, he's like, so tell me, which lines do you want me to stammer on? And he said, all of them. Do it on every one at that beginning, to really, not to like oversell it, but just to, I think, establish what silence meant to him, that it was such a terrifying thing, because what it meant to him was, he's embarrassing himself. He's not being able to speak. But then later that silence takes on like he owns it. Like that silence is
deliberate.
Yeah, you're being deliberate. Like you're like you said, you're using your voice.
That's
you're
right.
Like that silence is part of your voice right now, and the time to think and the time to be solemn. So is that something that you have intentionally thought about as you preach, as you teach preachers? Like, because I don't know, as a teacher, I teach high school.
Right.
I've learned how important just wait time for students to process things is, to the point that sometimes like students need to get used to how long I will wait after I ask a question. So that there's an intentionality to that that's counterintuitive to the way a lot of people think. Is that something that you've thought of?
Yes. So, there are different kind of speakers. Some rely heavily on teleprompters and scripts. Some have very good memory and they remember exactly every point of what they want to say. I'm probably somewhere in between, but I'm really good at being extemporaneous and off the cuff. Very good at that. I mean, you don't do public speaking without being good at that, or at least in the way that you do it as a pastor, where you have to be a little flexible in some ways. I think it wasn't until maybe about 2 years ago where I started using silence a little more. I think in the counseling moments, I'm not afraid of silence, because silence in counseling and silence in fundraising, they're uncomfortable for people, but whoever breaks that silence first in fundraising generally is going to lose. But especially when you've made the ask for money. But secondly, when you're counseling people, sometimes making a point or asking a question or letting them talk, the therapist or the counselor has to take silence, because silence, it's uncomfortable for them. So they're going to feel like they have to say something, but it also it kind of says, hey, look, if you're not ready to talk, we're just going to sit here in silence and be okay with that. I think as I speak publicly, though, silence has made me slow down and pause more, not necessarily for deeper thought or reflection. I wish I could say that, but to not trip over my words, to not use unnecessary fillers, to communicate as clearly as possible, to express my thoughts in a clear and concise way.
To make your words matter.
Absolutely. Prime example, my pastor we had a conference at the church this past weekend, and we were honoring him. And I knew that I had to say something, but I didn't know what I was going to say. So I made it up in my head as I was sitting down, like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And it still wasn't fully there. I probably stood up. I was about 60% of the way there in my head. And I just said, okay, I'm going to push my way through it. And I just, I spoke in a slow tone, slow pace, and it just came together. And to people in the room, they thought I was being deep. I could tell because they were like,
yeah, you hear that.
They were really feeling it. But little do they know, I was really fetching for what's next.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It reminds me of, and this is actually very timely because the comedian Norm Macdonald passed away.
That's right.
Yesterday.
Yeah.
But everybody's talking right now about how his moth joke is one of the greatest jokes ever told. And I'm not going to really get into it. I would butcher it if I tried it, and it would take forever to do. So I'm not going to do that. But I will say, just go to YouTube and watch it. It is brilliant. It is such a great joke. But then he had a video where someone asked him about, the development of not just that joke, but a lot of his jokes. But then he used it as an example where he basically said that, like, what we now talk about as maybe one of the greatest jokes ever told was really just like a 20-second joke that Colin Quinn had told him, like basically the setup and the punchline that's been around for ages. It's not even Colin Quinn's joke. It's just a joke that's been around for ages. And he had already done a segment on Conan. They cut to commercial, and Conan said, all right, we're going to come back and you're going to be back on. And he's like, what? I thought we were done. He's like, you got to fill like 5 minutes. And he's like, what? And he basically just decided, I'm just going to do this joke, but I'm going to stretch it out for the entire time. And that was the joke. That's what made it funny. And that's, to me, such a perfect example of like what you're talking about, of kind of being in the moment, gathering your thoughts, being deliberate, and also just finding your voice. Like that now is what we know as Norm Macdonald's voice. That's his voice, is that joke. Right. Little did we know that it was just him trying to fill 5 minutes, and that's how he did it. And like you're talking about with the speech you gave. And I think it all ties back to this movie, where I find it interesting that the movie does talk a lot about him finding his voice. And that's just a thing we talk about. Like, everybody has a voice. Like, and you need to find your own voice. And a lot of times we talk about it in terms of finding your personality, or making sure you feel valued, making sure that you feel like you have a place in the room, you have a seat at the table, you have a voice.
That your story is told.
That your story is told. And I think it's interesting in the movie that they actually just take it literally. Like, this is your voice. Listen to the way you speak. Listen to how you put together words, And it's something that actually has been a weird byproduct of this podcast, because we record it. I have to listen to it meticulously as I edit it. I have heard my voice, and everybody, you talk to anybody, I hate the sound of my own voice, And that's true. I mean, I always hated the sound of my own voice, but I've listened to it so much now. I'm sure Ryan can maybe say the same thing. You do a podcast long enough, you hear your own voice, and I'm sure with preaching, you probably hear your own voice enough to where it does take time, but it is worth getting comfortable with your voice and not feeling like the way you speak is inadequate, or not feeling like the way you put sentences together, the way you express your ideas is inadequate. Like, it's good enough, You just have to learn how to craft it and own it. And
in homiletics, we use the same term.
That's the movie. Like, that's really what Lionel Logue does. I mean, he does a few exercises, but ultimately it's really just about, this is how you speak. Let's figure out how to make it yours and make it your own,
In homiletics, we use the same notion of voice, just a little more nuance. We'll say, it is personality in your preaching, and in the African-American preaching tradition, for example, at the end of sermons, not all, but some, intonate, and they do what's called hooping, where they're talking and singing in a rhythmic fashion with a musician. And it's really fanciful. People have written books on this, but then different preachers do it differently. Aretha Franklin's father many people tried to be like him.
Mhm.
And some of learning how to find your voice in a way that has its own cadence, its own rhythm, and one that your congregation gets used to and vibes with takes time. It takes knowing when your actual literal voice is at the point of being strained, or how to actually conserve it. But then how does your personality in the sermon itself, or in the corpus of your work as a preacher, how does your voice appear then, in terms of what ways, what patterns, speech patterns do you have in your preaching? Do you use humor? Do you use a lot of poetic language? Are you just plain speech? And how does your individual personality bleed through? And it takes, for a preacher at least, it takes, a good 5 to 7 years to find that.
And it's such a holistic process.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that Bertie didn't get.
Mm-hmm.
He thought, just fix it. Fix
Yes.
the problem. Then I can talk. And Lionel knew there's so much more that needs to come into this.
Yes.
There's so much more that's producing this stammer. There's so much more that's keeping you from overcoming it.
Right.
And there's so much more in there than you think. And that is, I think, one of the pretty remarkable things about the movie is that it contains the intrigue of like behind the scenes royalty, and the historical context of it is vital, and the inner workings of the family dynamics, but it all centers around one person's finding himself
Right.
and finding his voice.
And this is, this movie comes out before the language is used of emotional intelligence, or where, everyone has a therapist now.
Right.
And that's not to diminish it. I think everybody needs therapy to a degree. But this comes out before then. And you see this man who is really essentially living a traumatized life.
Right.
And the role of Duke of York, potential heir to the throne, and then king, those roles, the royal roles, masks his trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of people in our world who experience deep, deep trauma that don't have anything to mask it. And it plays out in different ways. But this particular person, Colin Firth's character, or Bertie, they run away from going deep. At the beginning, we don't talk about personal matters.
Mm-hmm.
Don't call me Bertie.
Right.
Even the distance that he had where, Logue sits back a few feet from him and, does not want to answer personal questions. And he tells them, we can do mechanics, and mechanics will only help you a little bit. But unless we get to the deeper core of the issues, it's not going to happen. And it takes the death of his father to bring to light the deep and heavy emotions, the traumatic scars that he carried in his soul. And that's generally, as a pastor, you see that a lot. It generally takes life crises to show you just how trauma shapes you. And this man, from a father who was overbearing, trying to keep the monarch alive because it's always in danger, to a nanny who starves him and pinches him when he cries, to the loss of his brother Johnny, and how, and this is very typical British, how you're not allowed to grieve that.
That stiff upper lip.
That stiff upper lip.
Yeah.
And that sort of handicaps him. I think of Jesus's question, do you want to be made well? He could not be the leader he needed to be. And granted, yes, the prime ministers do all the work, but he could not be the figurehead. The monarch represents consistency. It represents persistence, that as long as there is a king, long live the king, long live the queen, that we have a nation. But he's not able to do that if he never comes to the place of really finding redemption and healing through going deep with a friend.
And we also see how big a step it is for him just in the glimpses of his family.
Yes.
Like the way his brother can't handle any of the pressure and can't really own his desires, And that scene where his brother breaks down and hugs their mom and she can't even put her hands on him. And her face, she just goes like numb. It's almost like she dissociates in that moment. Then that makes his steps towards healing all the more brave.
And Logue tells him that while standing on the stone of Scone. He says, man, you're the bravest person I know.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
You see this whole thing in the movie where he volleys back and forth between fear and courage. Fear is his kryptonite. It's always with him. It never goes away. So in that sense, it's not triumphalistic. It's always there, and he has to battle it. And the pathway to his fear is his pain. And he has to learn how to deal with his pain to be able to cope with his fear. Mm-hmm. And Logue tells him, you're the most courageous person I know, because that's not something that anyone is willing to do.
It's interesting to me that the thing that ultimately almost fractures the entire relationship is really when he just says, you could be king. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's a really loaded thing that you could really tear apart, because there's a surface level, that's an offensive thing to say because I'm not supposed to be the king. And you are really...
It was treasonous.
It's treason. There's like that level. But then you also wonder, is it also just what you're talking about, that fear is so great, where he's actually thinking, no, on a very personal level, I cannot be king.
Right.
Yes.
And I often wonder, and this kind of gets to a larger question of why do so many people love to watch things and take in stories about royalty, about the royal family? And I think it kind of hits a little bit on that, where there's so much decorum around it. There's so much tradition. There's so much pressure from that tradition. In fact, at one point, it seems like they're almost equating being a royal to being indentured servitude.
Right. Well, yeah. He kind of made that joke early on. Yeah.
And I had never thought about it that way, really. Maybe when we watched Marie Antoinette with Kristen Dunst, we talked a little bit about that in that episode, about that idea of feeling trapped as a royal. Right. This really hits on not only feeling trapped, but feeling isolated, like we already said. What is it about the royal family, whether it's the crown, whether it's the Queen, which was another Best Picture winner?
That's right.
Yes, it was.
Helen Mirren. And
there's a new movie about Diana coming out.
And that's on top of how many documentaries we've seen about this stuff. And that's not even getting into the news coverage, the tabloids. We are very much... Even here in America.
The movie Jackie a couple of years ago, which isn't, about
kind of our
British royalty, but American royalty.
That's right.
And I think that part of it is that, these people definitely are in their own way very privileged. Mm-hmm. And we get to see how maybe it's not all that it's cracked up to be. So there's a little bit of myth breaking there. But at the same time, it's also allowing us to project, it's safe. It's safe for us to project ourselves onto them, because we know we'd never be them in a way. We would never be these people. So we can kind of, through storytelling, play around with all of these themes that are really, on a psychological, pathological level, probably going on within all of us, inside of us. But we're able to kind of, play with those in our own minds through this family that seems so distant and separate from us. And so there's also sort of this interesting universality to it. And it kind of goes to what you were saying, Ryan, where it's not always easy to make these sympathetic characters, because I think when you read history, where they're not getting into the people behind these figures, they're just figures.
Heartless people. Yeah,
they're heartless people. They're goofs. They're clowns. They're buffoons. They're just heartless people that are all about maintaining power. They're in some ways evil. Let's be honest. Because the movie starts out by saying that the monarch ruled over a quarter of the world's population. Are you kidding? Well, what does that mean? That means colonialism. That means that
Exactly.
One of the things that to me is really fascinating is that we are somehow able to kind of hold those two together. We can kind of acknowledge that the whole idea of royalty is kind of messed up to begin with.
Yes.
But then we can also watch these stories and be like, but they still are human.
That's an interesting tension this movie carries.
Yeah.
I had a similar thought, but I went down a different street with it. I think Henry VI, his father, might have been the first one to really do that broadcasting stuff. And
you mean George VI?
George VI, there we go. I keep saying Henry. George VI, his father might have been the first to do the broadcasting. We know that Elizabeth kind of takes the same line where because of her husband, opens up the door for them to be in the house. And so I couldn't help but ask if these shows that sort of humanize at least the British royals, if it's a way for them to still preserve power. And because when you go to England, the majority of English people are very much for their royals, but you have a growing group who are we don't need them out. And it was a good example. You can go there now and visit castles. You could go to Windsor Castle and see the whole darn thing, except for the private quarters, because from the the queen, on down to like dukes and earls and lords, were forced into this place of having to say, we got to open up our lives or we won't have a spot anymore. Mm-hmm. I wondered actually if their opening up their lives created this sort of intrigue that said, let's be sympathetic, and then also helps us wonder, is it better on the other side? But then if we have shows, which I'm not trying to be conspiracy theorist, I'm not trying to say, obviously they did not write that show, but where we humanized George VI and we humanized the Queen. Let's show the sympathy so they could say, okay, man, pity them. They keep their spot. Right, they're slaves to us anyway.
Right,
they're really not.
Yeah. Like, oh, you think we like this?
Right. You think we enjoy having all of this gold and never having to pay bills and like having people wait on us?
Yeah.
That was that was the thought. I didn't go far.
I think that's valid. I think that's incredibly valid. Like, why now are we getting so much access to their histories and their lives? Like, if they didn't want writers to have access to it, they could stop it.
And they're mad at like the BBC for like the Diana thing that came on.
Yeah,
they portrayed her in the Queen in the Crown, and they were hot.
It certainly could enter conspiracy theory territory, but I don't think that the way that powerful people have worked in the past would dispel the notion that you're exploring.
Well, you're really talking about kind of a PR move.
Yeah,
right.
I mean,
establishing a narrative.
It's not really conspiracy. It's more like times have changed. Times have changed. Mm-hmm. We've got a PR problem. What can we do about it? We can let people in a little bit more, and we can show them that we're actual human beings. Now, are we playing into it by watching it, enjoying it, all that stuff? I don't know. But I think that the royal family does exist. There is drama to it, and it is interesting to take slices of it and just kind of dissect it a little bit and pull universal truths about humanity out of it.
That's right.
And maybe the King's Speech doesn't necessarily hammer on this, but it doesn't shy away from the fact that it's also sort of saying this is a natural outflow of that type of power structure.
Yeah.
Sure, it's saying like, yes, life was hard for him, but it's also saying like, he has accepted that because we have accepted that as the byproduct of this type of power. To sort of examine, like, this is bad for everybody.
That's right.
Like, this sort of toxicity is present up there, and it's absolutely going to flow down in some way.
Mm-hmm. It's a movie that I think is brilliant because I do think at the same time it shows a wonderful picture of friendship and how sad isolation is. And, you cannot live this life without friends. And I think there are certain elements of the film where friendship is not reciprocated at certain points. Like, where Logue is trying to, he's a client, he's a professional, but he's trying to be a friend to this man. And then, finally, I think one of the most moving parts in the film is when he sits down at that desk and he says, man, thank you. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here. And he says, thank you, Lionel.
Your first wartime speech. Congratulations.
I expect I shall have to do a great deal more. Thank you, Logue. Well done, my friend.
Thank you, Your Majesty.
To see that this man who had no friends, didn't know how to relate to people,
right?
Just this cold distance, but then he comes close and he shakes his hand and says, "Thank you, friend." So you kind of get to see, I think the beauty of friendship.
Is that one of the things that you notice now as you're a little bit older watching this movie that like, because Nate and I, for the last more than 10 years, we've met on like Tuesday nights with a couple of people.
Yeah.
And I was talking with one of those people last night, our friend Ethan, about how rare that seems to be for men, especially. And so my friend and I were talking, we don't remember our dads having friends like that. And I don't know if I hadn't established this routine with my friends in my early 20s, if this is a routine I could have established now when I'm 36, you know?
You know, that stood out even then, thinking about, I have a friend who I talk to multiple times a week. 15 years ago, we were prayer partners. So we got on the phone and prayed every day. And then like now, you know, we don't pray as much anymore. I don't know if that's bad, but you know, we talk all the time and about everything from preaching to, you know, we crack mama jokes from time to time. And so I think the beauty of friendship where you're able to be open and vulnerable and not be judged for who you are or your feelings or your thoughts, your weaknesses, your struggles. I don't know how people make that and in this world without that, without having one or several of people like that, you know, because life has ebbs and flows. There are times where it's up, and then there are times where it's very dark, very sad, heartbreaking even. And it's been my friend who has helped me through pretty much a lot of the flows of life for the last almost 20 years. And so I think being able to kind of see how that worked for them in a weird way, it just touches my heart as I think of my friend.
Were there other things that 10 years older that the movie hits you differently, or you notice different things as you've become a father, you've got a career,
a working professional?
Yeah. You know, you've got a congregation too. You are a leader, right?
Yes. The thing that I came seeing and recognizing more was just the theme of pain and redemption. And as a pastor, we would say the world is fallen in that sense. And that no matter who you are and where you are, life has its way of tainting you in some way. You know, you will experience some level of pain. So like I felt the emotion of it the first time I saw it, but thinking now as I walk with people through so much pain often and seeing how that pain oftentimes leads them to self-sabotage. Even myself, I think of how like I've had to wrestle with my own insecurities and feeling imposter syndrome in almost every stage of life for myself, and how I've had to wrestle with that. Watching the film, I think what jumped out, like even how he's in this big cavernous room and they're standing behind this table, and even the camera shot, which I never paid attention to, but even the camera shot has like the camera looking up at these men. And even as he's talking and he's stuttering over his words, he looks past them and he sees all of his predecessors or some of his predecessors. And he's looking at them like, I'm not them. And it's after that speech that he goes home and sits with his wife in front of the red box. And he says, I'm no king, where this fear has really taken control of him. So I think I saw that more as an adult, 37 years old, and how I've had to, in my own self, wrestle with feeling inadequate and like I should not be here. Everyone else is better at this than me. And that fear never leaves, but having to acknowledge it and find ways to cope and come around it.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel like we'd be almost remiss if we didn't mention Helena Bonham Carter at all.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yes.
Or Timothy Spall as Winston Churchill, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
He played that role very well. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
He got the facial expression.
Expression.
And, you know, they did throw in there also that he says in there that he also had a type of speech impediment or something. And I was actually doing some research on some like stuttering association websites, and they have pages of like celebrities and famous people who all had stutters, and Winston Churchill is in there. And I thought, man, that's interesting.
Fascinating.
That they were kind of in such overlapping circles and had to work together.
Well, and I mean, this is maybe a little, but Amanda Gorman, who gave that poem at the inauguration, she developed her voice in her speech therapy in school. That was where like spoken word was her way. You know how he kind of tells George VI to sing, sort of like that was the cadence and the performance of spoken word was how she, was therapy for her and her speech impediments. Yeah.
And that's interesting because that's a different voice.
Right.
Like that, I was on this website and they actually said that as a young girl, Marilyn Monroe had a stutter. And
Wow.
that breathiness in her voice was something that she learned through speech therapy. It's almost like a good speech therapist just figures out the way you're going to overcome this is to learn your voice, is to learn your tricks and techniques.
Wow.
You know?
Instead of
never
trying
knew
to
that.
fit into like this mold of proper speaking, you've
Right.
got to figure out how your voice properly speaks.
Yeah.
That's right.
And so going back to Helena Bonham Carter's character as, his spouse, what I find great about that character is, first of all, she loved him and saw the potential all along.
Right.
It was
All
always
along.
there. Never flinching. But she also knew that she couldn't be the answer. She couldn't
Right.
be the one that would get him to where he needed to be. She had to go find Lionel. And I don't know how true to history that is. I don't know if she was the one that did find him in real life and did all that. But for storytelling wise, I think especially in this day and age, because here's going back to our idea of friendship and what it does for you. I think we live in a time where we try to get that all from our spouse or
That's right.
significant or who we love or who we end up loving or being with. We look for that one person who is going to be all of that for us. And I think the movie just kind of shows that, like, of course she's a great spouse. She's committed, she's devoted, she loves him for exactly who she is. She has full confidence in him. But to understand that she's not enough. She can't make him feel the confidence he needs to feel.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting lesson for today, where I feel like a lot of men don't have friendships, and I think
That's very
that
real.
they kind of try to find everything they need in their work and in their spouse and in their family life and their kids. And if it's not all in there, then they kind of feel like either they're a failure or life sucks and there's no way to ever be fulfilled.
And they take it out. They take it out on the people around them.
And on
Yeah.
themselves.
Exactly. Right.
And on themselves. Absolutely.
And I mean, I think COVID
Oh yeah,
put
COVID
all
was
of us to the test, where we didn't have anybody else to talk to.
Our poor wives.
Like, yeah, and they heard every thought we had, every feeling, and and we saw the potential of those relationships to build us up, but we also saw the limit of that.
Yes.
And yeah,
Yes.
this movie touches on that too.
Yeah.
In this pandemic, I'm thinking about that. Like this summer last year, I mean, I was in the house with Kelly and the kids all day, every day. And they were fun. I had a great time with them. But I think I have a group of friends, unlikely group of friends, by the way, who prior to this, we were associates, but we committed to get together every Thursday night in one of our backyards, and we smoked cigars until our hearts were merry. And, and we just sat there, but we brainstormed ideas.
Yeah.
We kind of helped each other think through what are some next steps we need to take.
Sure.
But I look back on that year, look back on that summer, and I'm like, man, it was a very stressful period. I don't think I realized how stressed I was, but those moments of fellowship were really helpful for us. And we guarded it. Listen to that. We guarded it. Unconsciously, we were like, okay, Thursday's coming.
Yeah.
Ain't
That's
nothing happening
Tuesdays.
on
That's
Thursday.
Tuesdays for us. Yeah.
We guarded that thing. And it really helped us in tremendous ways.
I'm really glad you had that.
Yeah. So yeah, Watson, this is a movie that I don't think myself or Ryan were ever thinking of revisiting, to be honest.
Yeah.
And so in a way, it's
You're
just
welcome.
like a huge
Yeah,
thank you.
thank you.
A huge thank you for
Absolutely,
that.
thank you.
It's a great movie. And Nate, listen, I know it wasn't up to snuff for you in 2010, but now you're able to see it out
I've
of the
seen the light,
context
yes,
and
out of
noise
the-
of all of
yeah.
that. And now you can admit it's one of the greatest movies of the last 20 years.
Whoa.
And I'm talking about better than Matrix, better than all of them.
Okay.
Well,
Maybe we'll have to watch it a couple times a week for a few years.
Yeah, we got to get the Watson experience on this to really have it soak in that much.
But I like this idea of watching Best Picture winners 10 years after they won.
Yeah.
And see.
I think
how it
noise.
holds up.
You called it noise, and I think that's exactly what it is. There's actually quite a few movies that I've been like you, Watson. I've been in that seat where I'm trying to tell somebody. I know there was a lot of backlash around that movie around the Oscars. You got to watch it apart from that because it on its own, as a standalone movie, it's solid. It's a solid movie.
Yes, it is. Very solid. You're welcome.
Yeah. No, thank you. Honestly, thank you. It's been great talking to you.
So, hey, before we go, Watson, for any of our listeners out there that would maybe want to seek you out a little bit, see what you're talking about, do you want to share it all with our listeners, Twitter or Instagram or anywhere people can find you?
Yes, Facebook is Watson Jones III, even though no one of our generation is on there like that anymore. Or Instagram and Twitter, both handles are Watson Jones 3.
Is that the number 3 or like 3 eyes for the Roman
Good
numeral?
question, Nate.
Yeah.
Number 3.
We're an audio format here, so we got to kind of really spell it out.
Watson Jones and the number 3.
Number
Yes.
3. Okay.
Yes, Watson Jones, the number 3.
Definitely go seek that out if you're listening.
And I know you've had some cool stuff, like you were in DC, right, recently on a panel with Jamar Tisby and Kemeni Uwan. And do you have anything like that coming up? Any other sort of like speaking engagements or any special projects coming up?
I do have some preaching engagements coming up. I'm doing a regional for Exponential in October, and then Jen's regular preaching engagement stuff that's happening. But other than that, I think that's the last conference thing I'm doing. Then it just drops in terms of less busy towards December.
That's good.
Not a bad thing sometimes. Yeah.
Because December's busy enough on its own.
Busy enough on its own. Yes.
Well, it's been so cool watching your career, watching you flourish as a pastor and as a speaker, and as an academic and as a Genesis fan.
That's right.
And
That's right.
I'm really glad that we got the chance to talk to you tonight. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Watson.
Thank you. It's good seeing you guys again.
You too.
All right. So, Ryan, what are we going to be doing for our next episode of Can We Still Be Friends? We all know what this is.
Tis the season.
Tis the season.
It's the most wonderful time of the year.
Yes.
We're entering our 3-month season, kicked off with our holiday spooktacular.
Oh,
our
man.
eighth annual holiday spooktacular.
And it is going to be a spectacle of a spooktacular.
Oh, it's going to be the spookiest of spooktaculars.
Yes, the spookiest, the most festive.
The tuxedos will be worn. The disco ball will be flashing light all over the place in a spooky way, but also very like cool.
Yeah, of course. It's got to be cool spooky.
Yeah.
The spooky tinsel will be hung
on the
gallows
dead tree.
And the dead trees. Yeah.
Yeah, with care.
You don't do that carelessly.
No.
You do it with care.
If you want it to be spooky, you do it carefully.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, obviously, we're bubbling over with the season. We know you're probably already making travel plans as safely as possible to get together with family around the pumpkin.
Head into the patch.
Yeah, go into the patch to chop down your own pumpkin, and of course, watching a scary movie with us.
Yes. I mean, 'tis the season.
'Tis the season. What else are you going to do?
If you're going to celebrate the spooktacular, this is just part of it. It's kind of like, that other holiday that we, do get to in December. You know what I'm talking about? The December holiday that everybody celebrates.
Yes, I do. The name escapes me, but I do remember. What
I don't
you're
know
talking
either.
about.
I just know that like Charlie Brown Christmas.
That's it.
Charlie Brown Christmas is part of that. Can We Still Be Friends? Holiday Spooktacular is part of the Spooktacular.
Exactly.
I mean, it might as well be airing on ABC.
That's true.
How I feel.
Yeah. This year we've got a movie that's celebrating an anniversary in that 30 years ago.
30 years. Wow.
We'll just tell you, we are doing 1991's smash hit, Oscar-winning, The Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah. Sodal, for short. Does anybody say that?
I have not heard that.
I haven't either. I just made it up. But
I don't know if that... I mean, we don't misstep very often. If we commit to that, I might call that a misstep.
That would be maybe where the Holiday Spooktacular jumps the shark.
A little bit.
Was the moment when Nate and Ryan started calling Silence of the Lambs
felt the need to abbreviate Silence of the Lambs.
That's not a spooktacular thing to do.
No. That move is tantamount to hanging tinsel carelessly.
I'm sorry. I love my acronyms.
You do.
All right? And sometimes
they have their time.
They do. This was
but
not
tis not the season.
Tis not the season for this. That's correct. Yeah.
So we've got,
But Silence of the Lambs.
Iconic performances.
All around.
Everywhere.
Yeah. You can't
watch
blink.
a second of that movie without catching an iconic performance.
Yes. If you blink, you'll miss an icon.
Yeah.
That's what I always say about Sodal.
That's right. And you need to stop saying it. Of course, Anthony Hopkins in one of the shortest Best Actor winning roles ever. Jodie Foster. And of course, Ted Levine as Buffalo Bill.
But some people might be wondering, hey, I thought you guys were kind of like doing this new thing.
Right.
Like you're having guests come on and all that kind of stuff. And we are. I don't think we're going to totally jettison that. But we're entering into holiday season.
Yeah.
That's kind of the way we look at it.
Yeah, and holiday time's family time.
Right. So we're gonna kind of get back to traditions a little bit. Traditional Can We Still Be Friends? We got the Spooktacular in October. If you don't know, I don't know how you don't know this, but by the time you get to November,
you got
Thanksgiving, and we're already preparing for that as well.
Right.
It's a busy time for us. That's kind of where we don't really think we could bring a guest into this.
Right. It is a whirlwind here.
Right.
And
Working
to bring someone in
clock
would be a little unfair to them.
Right. So yeah, we're gonna for now we're gonna kind of take a little breather from the guest thing. I think the guest thing, as far as the way I kind of see it, is it was a great thing to do kind of through the summer.
Yeah.
It was a good summer thing to do.
Once I went back to work and my schedule became a lot less flexible, it became a lot harder for us to do that.
Yeah.
Worth it,
totally.
but also very difficult.
Yeah. And so I think we'll come back to it.
Yes.
But I think for right now we're gonna go back to just me and Ryan.
Yeah. It's family
Nate,
time.
if you didn't know who the me was.
Yeah.
Nate and Ryan. Holiday Spectacular, Thanksgiving, and we'll definitely do that. The holiday movie for whatever that thing. I don't. We just said it, but I can't remember what
Charlie
that is.
Brown Christmas. That's
Christmas. Yes, we'll do. And
it. They need that running start.
Yeah, but we'll do something festive for that month as well. So got a lot coming up.
Yeah.
We hope you guys join us. The next one, like we said, is going to be Silence of the Lambs. So please, if you can take it.
Yeah.
Not everyone can.
Ooh.
But if you can take it.
And if you can't, no
We understand.
judgment.
We
No
understand.
judgment.
Yeah. And
I'm worried about myself here.
yeah. We'll get through it. So yeah, let us know your thoughts on Silence of the Lambs. Definitely
King's
on the
Speech.
King's Speech. Any of our other past episodes. We got a lot of ways you can connect with us. So we hope you do. Let's just run through some of those ways, shall we?
Yeah, well, I always like to start it off with good old Facebook.com. Can We Still Be
good place
Friends
to start.
podcast. We've got Instagram, which is another Facebook company.
Yeah.
And there we shorten it to Can We Still Be Friends Pod. We've got our website, always available, canwestillbefriends.net.
Yeah, it is available. Around the clock available.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Can We Still Be Friends?
Yeah, we got that. We've got that going
Got that worked out,
24/7.
24/7.
And our email is closely related. It's feedback@canwestillbefriends.net.
That one's around the clock too. You can send anytime.
Anytime.
Don't worry about it bouncing back. I mean,
Right.
I know, I worry about that all the time when I send emails. It's going to bounce back. But
Yeah.
I can tell you with confidence, if you send us an email, it will get to us.
Right.
And also, not just email. You can also send a voice message as well. How did that come out that way? I have no idea how that came out that way. Was there something deep down that just came out? I don't know. As whale. Anyways, send us a voice message. 847-306-9532 is the number to call.
You can also record it in the voice recorder app of your phone and send that in an
Package
email.
that up, send it in an email, and if you send us a voice message, we'll make sure we try to work that into the episode somehow. So, boy, it's getting late.
Yep.
And I think we're getting ready to wrap this up. But thank you so much for listening, as always. If you do want any sort of way to give back at all for the Spooktacular, it's the holidays, tis the season. If you want to give,
Season of giving.
we don't ask for money.
Nope.
We don't have any sort of paywall subscription plan. We just ask, hey, maybe just tell your friends, tell your family, and think about leaving us a nice little rating on Apple Podcasts. That'll go a long way. So, you got anything else to say, Ryan?
No, just another thank you to Watson for
Definitely.
joining us.
Yeah,
and thank you to everybody who listened.
Thanks a lot. We'll catch you next time.